My name is Dr. Richard Stacey. As Katie said, I am a lecturer in English literature, and I'm also the widening participation officer for our division, which is the School of Critical Studies. I also convene our large first year module, 1A Poetry and Poetics, which is taught to over 420 students each September. It's the first literature module they encounter at university, and it's the largest module in the School of Critical Studies, if not the College of Arts. I'm also, in another strand of my career, I'm quite heavily involved in Key Stage 5 provision in England for GCSE English literature, and I was on a small committee of people which designed the most recent A-level syllabus for English literature with OCR. So in this session, I'm going to be discussing ways in which we might be able to help students critically engage with literary texts. I'm going to be focusing on primarily on one poem. It's a beautiful piece, which tends to be set for Key Stage 4 or Key Stage 5. Some of you may know it. It's titled Letters from Yorkshire by Maura Dooley. Now, I'm going to be exploring the poem through the steer of several keywords. These are words which are cited in the course specification for Higher English by SQA, and they focus on the component titled Reading for Understanding, Analysis and Evaluation. Now, I've cherry-picked a few of the keywords from the specification here. I've not cut and pasted, but you can see that the kind of steers that the exam board give teachers as part of their kind of practice in order to enable the material to be assessed. But there are three words that I'm going to be particularly focusing on today in this presentation. And these words are understanding, analysis, and evaluation. And I've chosen these words because they're words that bridge the gap. They provide a really nice overlap between some of the things I tend to do in relation to Key Stage 5 and A-level in a school-based context, and then the kind of pedagogy that I practice with first-year students coming to university for the first time. So here is the poem, Letters from Yorkshire. As I said earlier, some of you may be familiar with it. It's quite well known. I am going to read it out because I'll be discussing different linguistic features within the poem. So it'd be quite good, I think, to get a handle on it. And also personally, I'm quite keen to promote the value and the sheer artistry of poetry when it's increasingly an increasingly insecure feature of educational syllabi. So I'll just read this out now. Letters from Yorkshire by Maura Dooley. In February, digging his garden, planting potatoes, he saw the first lapwings return and came indoors to write to me, his knuckles singing as they reddened in the warmth. It's not romance, simply how things are. You out there in the cold, seeing the seasons turning, me with my heart full of headlines, feeding words into a blank screen. Is your life more real because you dig and sow? You wouldn't say so, breaking ice on a water butt, clearing a path through snow. Still, it's you who sends me word of that other world, pouring air and light into an envelope, so that at night, watching the same news in different houses, our souls tap out messages across the icy miles. Absolutely amazing piece of work. So our first word is understanding. This is the word obviously promoted quite early on by SQA, and it's a word I think all of us would be quite keen for our students to get to grips with. Understanding is almost a base skill, it seems to me. It's a word which ascertains whether the student has understood the core meaning of the text, its subject matter. Now, in my experience, I don't know if anybody agrees with this, sometimes when students are approaching poems for the first time, they tend to adopt a top-down approach almost with a preconceived idea of the poem, which is imposed or stamped onto the language on the page. I think my instinct is this word understanding is asking the student to flip this idea or this assumption on its head, to start with words and syntax and make sure that they're building their initial meaning from these tiny building blocks. So I'm going to be discussing some possible strategies that you might find useful. These are strategies that we tend to use on 1A Poetry and Poetics with our first years who come to us straight from school. I did have some students who were guinea pigs, so I'm just going to be discussing the strategies based around these keywords now, and then give you a sense of what our first years came up with, who are only a few weeks into their degree program. So the first thing I do with students on 1A Poetry and Poetics, especially if they find the language really inscrutable, is ask them to define a poem as a playlet, as a miniature drama with characters and a kind of plot or a storyline. I found that this is a great way of utilizing some of the skills which students will have acquired from other literary forms, such as prose and drama, whilst helping them to move past the feature of poetry, which seems most intimidating at first, the perceived obscurity of literary language. Now, I would always start with the main character, who is the speaker. It's familiar to everybody watching this that the speaker is a voice or a kind of persona, a ventriloquized entity that's composed of words. However, we all know that many students do have a habit of associating the speaker with the poet themselves, seeing the I as a kind of confessional key. On 1A Poetry and Poetics, this happens all the time. It's something that we're quite keen to engage with in terms of understanding. It happens for all kinds of poets, especially Robert Browning, who is the king of the dramatic monologue. I think for many of our first years, they find him to be sometimes a confessional poet, a bit like Sylvia Plath. So one way in which I think you can help students to think about understanding is through the use of pronouns. So I have my students, I kind of put the poem in front of them, sat them down, and tried to get them think about who is inhabiting these poems, which characters or entities, through the use of pronouns. And you can see there are some color-coded pronouns here, 2 primary colors, and then a third one near the end. So if you use kind of highlighted pronouns as a route into understanding, characters emerge quite quickly. And you can see here straight away there are 2 characters. One seems to be maybe a farmer, certainly somebody who's associated with rural life. The other is more home-based, typing at a laptop, and then other kind of contrasts start to emerge. So one is outside and the other is inside. The next thing I'd do as this route into understanding this kind of key word would be to ask the students, now they've got a grip of the characters in the poem, to see how they move through the world which is being fashioned by the poem, how they're animated by the poet, what happens to them. And I think this is the second feature of that primary initial understanding, a grasp of the situation of the represented figures, what maybe amounts to a tiny plot. So again, when I kind of spoke to my students about this and use pronouns as a steer, particular types of action or behavior start to emerge in relation to the colors. So we can see that one character is attempting to communicate the wonders of a rural winter landscape to a speaker. They're both apart in different houses, essentially in different worlds, and they're both using language, words, typing, letters, forms of kind of linguistic interaction to communicate with each other. And then we can also see at the end with purple that these pronouns shift, they modulate. So they start with he, then we find the word you, a kind of more intimate form of address. And then in the last stanza, they become our, a kind of plural. So the pronouns, I think, really seem to help students map the story and the characters onto the poem, and it really helps them to kind of break the back of understanding exactly what the poem is about and avoiding this kind of top-down approach. So that's one strategy that we tend to use on 1A Poetry and Poetics with our first years. My second keyword is analysis. This is a critical steer, which has been included by SQA in their material on close reading skills. To my understanding, obviously it's a very kind of broad and in some ways quite a loose term. In my understanding, analysis is the exploration of effect, the meanings which are produced on the page by the use of language, words and images. Now, as everybody watching this knows, effects are really difficult for a lot of students to grasp. As convener of our poetry module, it's the single most common piece of feedback we give to the first years. However, it is one of these primary critical steers which are offered by SQA in the prospectus. And in some ways, analysis is the richest, most exciting part of literary engagement. It's the identification of the lexical traces and ingenuities which can cultivate themes and concepts. I also think if analysis is predicated on evidence, which it tends to be in literary studies, I think there are also some really nice transferable skills here in relation to evidence, as I've said, but also objective reasoning. And as part of my practice, I'm always amazed at how similar the analysis of literary evidence can be to something like science, where you maybe start with a reading, an intuition, a sense of understanding, and then work back to a source, gathering specific evidence, which will prove whether your reading, your meaning, your theory is cohesive or persuasive. So with the students, when we're beginning to embark on analysis, the analysis of effects, I always ask the students to identify specific pieces of evidence, textual evidence, which coalesce around character, which have been used effectively to shape these characters, these kind of represented entities in the text. I also stress here that the analysis of a text will be much sharper if the students engage with these represented figures as textual constructs rather than real people with private thoughts and feelings, constructs which are designed to generate effects. If you kind of put that idea in place in a kind of classroom or seminar-based environment, I think that's half of the job done. That a kind of character as almost as a meaning-making entity in a sense. So once our students have gathered any primary textual evidence which coalesces around character and story, they can start wondering which specific effects are generated through metaphor, language, and words. And they're very likely, or in my case, students are very likely to start identifying image chains. So they'll see that certain images tend to be associated with certain actions or particular metaphors or similes coalesce around particular characters. So when I'm beginning to think about analysis and effects, I ask them to think about the evidence associated with character and how that's essentially or effectively transformed into a metaphor. And I think once you've done this, you're in a really good position to start engaging with literary analysis. So throughout the poem, we can see throughout Letters of Yorkshire, Dooley uses, it seems to me, two particular image chains. One is focused on ice, the weather, this kind of wintry landscape, breaking ice on a water boat, clearing a path through the snow, across the icy mile, you out there in the cold. That's one image chain, and that seems to coalesce around, I guess, one of these characters, the male lover almost. And another image chain is writing and language. So we get words such as headlines, feeding words, word of that other world, envelope, news, tap out messages, almost like a kind of either tapping at a keyboard or even in an older discourse, a kind of telegram. So once the students have cultivated a degree of evidence, and this evidence is helping them to understand the poem and embark upon analysis, I start to ask, we ask them to think about why that evidence is significant. And there are several phrases that I tend to use. I'll just go back again. So you probably use this in your teaching practice. There are analytical words. If a student has identified that ice imagery is recurrent throughout the poem, the question is next, what are the effects generated by ice imagery? And one way in which I tell the students to shape their words and their response through analytical verbs. So this suggests, or this implies. That's a way in which the understanding of the poem can be harnessed and moved towards a form of analysis. So I use my students as guinea pigs. I asked them to discuss some of the effects of these image chains that they identified, the idea of ice imagery, this snow imagery that runs through the poem, and then also this kind of typing imagery or this language imagery. And these are the type of things that the students came up with. What's the effect of ice imagery? They thought that it contrasted with the growing warmth of an emotional human connection, and it even presages this implied connection through images of thawing, the idea of ice kind of slowly melting, and the evidence there was his knuckles singing as they reddened in the warmth. There's a lovely image there. And another effect of the ice imagery our first years identified was that they felt it established a contrast between two different types of struggle, one rural and one defined by modern pressures. So the ice imagery of the outdoor world was contrasted, they felt, with a more kind of safe indoor domestic space. When I asked the students to think about some of the analytical effects which were produced by this other strain of imagery, typing imagery, here is what our students came up with. They felt that the images used by Dooley were an attempt to the level of metaphor to traverse distance in space. So our souls tap out messages across the icy miles. That was a really lovely sense of effect, a sense of analysis the students came up with there. And then also language, they felt language in the poem can recreate and even reform the outside world. And the evidence they highlighted was, sends me word of that other world, pouring air and light into an envelope. So there's some there are some approaches that we tend to adopt in relation to analysis, this skill that AQA are asking, SQA, sorry, are asking teachers to engage with. That's how we approach this on 1A Poetry and Poetics. So our third keyword that I'm going to be focusing on is evaluation. Evaluation is quite a tricky critical skill to master. A bit like analysis, our students tend to find difficulty with this, and it's very challenging to get to grips with, probably more so than the other two words. I would define evaluation as the attempt to consider why all of the prior information which has been gathered as part of a close reading of a poem, such as, for example, the understanding of the poem, including its characters and events, and the analysis of the meanings generated by literary language, the analysis of effects. Evaluation is the attempt to consider why this is significant. Why is all of this detail important or relevant or even interesting? This challenge is effectively asking students to sum up the cumulative achievement of the ideas, themes, or techniques which are present throughout the text. So in my teaching, the most useful word for the analysis of literary language, the evaluation of meaning in a poem, is why. Why is a bird image used when Emily Bronte's Poetic Speaker is looking out of the bars of a prism? Why does Great Expectations open in a graveyard with death and the somber spectres of the past? Why, if you ask the students why and they can come up with 1, 2, or maybe 3 answers, they tend to be evaluating the wider significance of the poem, the poem or the text and its meaning. When a poem has been understood and we have a fairly cogent understanding of the conceptual effects generated by imagery in a seminar space, I asked the students to do two things. One, with all of their analysis of effects, I asked them to extrapolate a possible theme or a concept based on the evidence. And then I asked them to answer the question, why? With a caveat that there is no one correct answer, only an evaluation of the possible significance of the idea being articulated in the wider text. And there are some phrases predicated on evaluative verbs that I ask my students to think about and incorporate as part of their academic writing skills. So I've often found that these phrases tend to work quite well with first year students when they're beginning to evaluate poetry. Through the use of ... duly signifies that ... that latter phrase signifies that. It encourages a student to use an evaluative verb and start to wonder why all of these effects have broader meaning in terms of interpretation. And then another phrase I've found to be really effective is a comparative phrase, just as ... usually referring to a particular image, so duly, and then that tends to be followed by a verb, which would be regarded as evaluative. So duly celebrates or subverts or criticizes or draws attention to. So coming up to near the end of my presentation now, I asked the students to start to think about how they would evaluate some of the close readings and their initial or primary understandings about the poem. I put them in small groups and asked them again to underline a particular theme or a concept that they found interesting. The students were really interested in language and the idea that words, this transmission of text, seems to not just be a metaphor that can generate effects. It's a bit richer than this and more expansive. It's akin to a theme. It's a key that can provide meaning to the poem in totality. So I asked them to do this. I gave them, I'll just go back on my slide. I gave them some of these sentence structures that they might find very effective as an inroad into evaluation. They underlined these quotes, and these are the kind of sentences that they came up with. Why is textual imagery significant within the poem? How would you evaluate the meaning of this? They said things like, through the use of textual imagery, duly signifies the importance of words and writing in maintaining human closeness. There's a really nice evaluative verb there in the word signifies. Then, just as the represented landscape is put into the letter by the lover as part of their description of the thawing winter world, as suggested by the verb pouring, duly uses the text of her poem to effect a reply. So that was a really nice point they came up with there, that the speaker inside the poem has received a letter, and the poem we are reading in our hands is in effect the speaker's reply. The poem becomes a kind of letter involved in a call and response. Thought that was a nifty bit of evaluation by our first years there that provided a good sense of meaning. And thus, throughout Letters from Yorkshire, duly celebrates the value of communication between humans who are far apart, who inhabit the other world. So that verb celebrates there is a really lovely evaluative word that allows the student to let you know that they've got a grasp on the wider significance of the text. So that's the end of my presentation. I've tried to use these steers, these critical keywords in SQA to establish overlaps between some of the things I do in my A-level career in Key Stage 5, and then the type of teaching we practice here at the University of Glasgow in our literature seminar rooms with our first years. I hope you've found this useful. I'm going to minimize these slides. We can stop the recording and then maybe begin a Q&A session.